So going through COVID, we kind of have this roller coaster, and we have these. It's been a little more than 2 years since we've been going through this, and we are not quite sure when we're going to have normal, or what normal is going to look like. But we're getting closer to how maybe we remember back in February of 2020 that things were. And one of the signs of change for us is that we have the choir here this morning. And we were kind of going through this morning a little bit and trying to remember. And Lee, you're going to have to, let's get this right here. You sang once since COVID, right? There was one time when things were, I think before Delta, that sort of that lull that we had, maybe May of last year, last fall, or when was that? In the fall. So, and then things came up again, and I was like, okay, here we go again. So let's hope this is a sign of things to come and more regular appearances, we hope, and look forward to hearing the choir in response to the sermon this morning. Our scripture is, as noted, is the feeding of the 5,000, and it's the passage, it's the version that's in Matthew, and I would encourage you just to look at all the Gospels and see the different versions and how they're different sometime this week. Not right now, but sometime this week. Just go through and look and see the subtle differences. I think the sermon's going to be a little bit of a mashup, maybe, of the different versions. But this is Matthew chapter 14, beginning with verse 13. Now, when Jesus heard this, I should back up. What Jesus is hearing is that John the Baptist has died. So let's be context here. Now, when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish. And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full, and those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. The word of the Lord. One of the most important things for me when I was a child, one of the things I could get really intensely excited about, was when I perceived that my sister got a bigger piece of cake than I did. It's the sort of thing that could ruin my evening. I could stew about that Kay got a bigger piece than I did, and that's not fair. It's not right. It's not just. I am older than she is, and I have always been bigger than she is. And if anybody deserves a bigger piece, it's me. Now, I don't know about the rest of you, but I think some version, for many of us, some version of this story we could tell from our childhood. A sense of rightness and fairness related to proportion or related to some sort of gift. Often food, but not always food. Sometimes it's some other gift that we perceive somebody else is receiving. more than we're receiving, a disproportionate share. We have an innate, strong sense as human beings, and maybe especially in our culture, but a strong sense of fairness and justness of justice and rightness, especially as far as we are concerned. When I've had the experience in my life to travel in other countries where things are often a lot cheaper. And when you go and you fly into an airport internationally, and one of the first things that you do is you look for a ride from the airport, a taxi ride from the airport. And you look, you get local info, or you read in like a Lonely Planet book to see what the appropriate fare is from the airport to where you're going, because you don't want to get cheated. Now, the fact of the matter is, when I've been in these situations, I can well afford to pay a North American rate for a taxi, but I don't want to. I don't want to be cheated out of what is right and just and fair. It doesn't matter that I can afford it. It doesn't matter that the taxi driver probably needs those few extra dollars more than I do. What matters is my sense of fairness and what is just and what is right. Why is that? Something really strong inside us thinks that way. When I watch a TV show where early on in the show, this is the way it goes. Early on in the show, there's an atrocity committed or a crime or some boorish sort of person behaving badly, just like, oh man, that makes me so mad. And I have to watch till the end of the show. Now, we joke, it often happens in our house that Beth will be watching a show, and I'll sit down and I'll watch the beginning of the show, and I don't want to get hooked into it, but I'll get hooked into it. And I gotta wait now to have that satisfying feeling of the bad guys getting theirs, whatever that might end up looking like. I don't know, but I need that feeling of satisfaction. To not have that is to feel like the meaning and sense of life itself is being disrupted. It's the very order of things is being turned upside down. I can't have it. I have got to see justice done. Boy, anybody? Am I alone in this? Is this from the looks of I am. Everybody's raising their hand. Yeah, it's pretty much you, Pastor. Could be. That's possible, I guess. I do feel strongly about this. When I read the news these days, there are so many things in the news that get me riled up. I get riled. Anybody else get riled up? Now, come on, be honest. Now, it's not just me, I'm sure. I know, I hear from some of you. You're riled up. I'm riled up. Boy, what's going on in Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, the fossil fuel industry. My son was telling me about these videos that he was watching about all the subsidies, public subsidies that the fossil fuel industry gets. How life is organized around their profits in our country. That makes me mad. That's not just. It's not fair. It's not right. Now, I can work up some pretty good sermons on this stuff if I wanted to. It's a powerful force within us, within each of us. And often we have different ideas, maybe, different things that we focus on about justice and fairness and what's right. But we are concerned often about proportion, about cheating, about people not getting what they deserve, or others not getting enough of what they deserve. Jesus, I'm going to abrupt shift here. We'll come back to this. Jesus has just heard that John the Baptist was beheaded. John the Baptist died. Now, you can imagine that this was pretty disturbing news. Not just the loss of John the Baptist, this beloved person who he knew, but the sense of injustice in the society and the time and place where he lived. And he needed to get away to a place where he could be alone, to pray, to process, to think, to reflect. So what does he do? He goes out in a boat to go across the lake, hopefully to a place where he could be alone. And what happens? The crowds see what's going on, and you can imagine them following along the shoreline. There's Jesus, there's Jesus, there's Jesus, trying to keep track of where he is so that they can go there and they can be there with him. And so he lands on the shore and goes into this deserted place, and there's a crowd. There is the crowd. There is no escape. Following him everywhere. And Jesus has compassion on the crowd and cures their sick and teaches them. And one of the Gospels, it's like they're like sheep without a shepherd, and Jesus has compassion on them because they don't know what to do. They can't make sense of anything, and so Jesus teaches them. Well, their time passes on, and it starts getting late. And the disciples come to Jesus and say, we have a situation here. We have a problem. We have a crowd on their hands, and they're going to start getting like Malachi without snacks, without something to eat. They're going to start getting grumpy and cranky and whatever, wailing or rah, it could be. This could be a problem. And the disciples' response, they don't say all these things, but their response is like, these people followed you. Nobody invited them here. We didn't invite them to come here. We were trying to get away, to reflect and to think and to pray. And here they are following you, Jesus. They're following you here. And they are here because of the choices that they have made. They should they not, be responsible for themselves, be responsible for their own supper. Send them away and let them buy food for themselves. In the world of the kind of fairness and justness and rightness in which we live, where we think about the size of the cake or the cost of the taxi ride, the logic of the disciples, the meaning they're trying to make of the situation is perfect sense. It's perfect sense. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. You give them something to eat. Like you could imagine the disciples' response. Are you daft? I mean, what are you thinking? So, well, all we've got are 5 loaves and 2 fish. 5 loaves and 2 fish. Now imagine the poor souls who actually brought food, who actually were responsible and thought ahead, who are actually taking care of themselves, who brought the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and the disciples come and say, hey, we're going to need that. We're going to need that to share this with everybody. And they're like, are you crazy? This isn't going to feed all these people. They should take care of themselves. I was responsible. I brought a lunch. Come on. But they give it to Jesus. And Jesus says, everybody sit down, takes it, breaks it, blesses it, and shares it. He gives it away. And there's enough for everyone. Now, this is a miracle. I mean, this doesn't happen in our everyday life. I mean, I don't know. It hasn't happened to me. Anybody else have had an experience like this where that's a miracle? It's exceptional. It's different. But it's also a sign that points to a different way of being, a different way of making sense of the world around us, a different way of thinking about what is just and right and fair. It is rooted in the idea of gift, of giving, of sharing. I'm going to say something that I think might be a little bit hard, a little bit conceptually difficult, so bear with me here. Every breath that we take, is a gift from God. The air itself, the beauty around us, a gift from God. The food that we eat, a gift from God. The water we drink, a gift from God. It is given to us. It's not mine to make sure that I get my just proportion. It is a gift. And when we live out of that sense of gift, out of that sense that our very lives are borrowed, as the hymn writer says, borrowed from God. Our very lives belong to God and are given to us as a blessed gift. It's a different way to make sense and to make meaning out of what is just and right and fair. Now, as I think about the news, as I read the news, I think that we're right to be upset about the injustices we see in the world around us. When I read the horrible things that are happening in the Ukraine, when I read this morning in the news about the mass executions of civilians that there's no evidence of in the area surrounding Kyiv, it's upsetting. It's deeply upsetting. And we are right to speak out against that and to recognize that as a wrong, as an injustice. The question I wonder about is, what is the reservoir, what is the energy, what is the space out of which we speak to that injustice? Jesus said, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That statement, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, comes out of that reservoir, that sense that everything is a gift from God, that life itself is a gift from God. And when we speak out of that sense, we can make meaning out of something like loving our enemies. Vladimir Putin is somebody who riles, like it's almost universally reviled in these days by just about everybody. There are a few people, but they're mostly just being difficult. I think most people can recognize that this is injustice. And when I see him at these tables where you see him, these really ridiculously long tables where he's at one end of the table and he's got an advisor or two at the other end. Can I love him? Can I recognize that he is a human being whom God loves, and the destruction that he's so responsible for in so many places also is coming back onto him? That in fact, He's destroying himself, living out of a sense of the right proportion of cake, and not out of a sense of God's love. He's missing out. He's missing out on joy. He's missing out on love. So as we look at a text like this extraordinary gift of free food, a free supper with Jesus, this extraordinary gift, can it shape the way that we make sense of the world around us? Can we, when we speak for justice, do so in a way that takes heart, that has courage, right? The word care, the word for heart, courage. A sense of God's love for everyone, a sense that all of our lives are borrowed from God, a gift. Can we do that? Bread in the scriptures is an important sign, which comes to us in many ways and in different forms in the scriptures. And I do acknowledge that there are cultures where bread is not the main source of food. I lived in the Philippines and it was rice. And so bread didn't quite make sense in the same way that we think of bread. And so for some of us who are gluten intolerant, bread means something entirely different. But bread is a sign, a symbol of God's generosity, of this sense that of this expansiveness of God's love. And this passage in Matthew 13 looks back through centuries of history, and especially looks back at manna in the wilderness, a deserted place. It's no accident that that's that way. A deserted place, the Israelites in a deserted place, hungry. And God and God's extravagant generosity provides manna, rains down manna, bread from heaven. And this passage looks forward. It looks forward to the table where Jesus gathers with his disciples and says, "This is my body, the bread of life given for you." Extravagant generosity. And it looks forward to every time we have communion together. It looks forward to that, when we celebrate God's generosity. And it looks forward to the time that is out of time in the age to come, when we will gather all together and feast at the heavenly banquet. The choir is going to sing "Fed and Nourished" in response, and I invite you to listen and to think about fed and nourished with the generosity of God, with God's generosity, with God's love. Amen.